Welcome, everybody. I'm Kevin Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of the Monroe County Bar Association, and I want to welcome you to the MCBA Rubin Center for Education in its remote manifestation. Today is September 16th, 2020, and this is a program entitled Voter Suppression Then and Now. It is sponsored by the Lawyers Coalition for Racial and Social Justice, which is a joint committee of the Rochester Black Bar Association, the Greater Rochester Association for Women Attorneys, and the Monroe County Bar Association. We want to thank the Modica Law Firm and Kamholtz Rossi PLLC for underwriting our CLE programs. The Modica Law Firm concentrates on employment, workers' compensation, and disability benefits cases. Kamholtz Rossi PLLC provides personal injury, medical malpractice, and construction injury representation using creative and adaptive methods to provide results. To comply with accreditation regulations, please fill out your affirmation form and evaluation sheet at the end of the program if you are one of those people who's seeking CLE credit. And then be sure to email it back to Danielle Matias. In exchange, we will send you your certificate of attendance after the program via email. All attorneys must attend programs in their entirety to receive credit. According to the New York State Continuing Legal Education Board, we are prohibited from issuing partial credit. With that, I'm going to turn this program over to our moderator, Dwayne Vasco.
Thanks, Kevin. And thank you everyone for joining us here this evening for this very important topic. I'd like to introduce our speakers, our panelists for this topic. You'll hear first from Pamela C. Johnson, who is a professor at Syracuse University College of Law. Professor Johnson has held several distinguished teaching posts, including the Hayward Burns Chair in Civil Rights at CUNY Law School, the Sparks Chair at the University of Alabama School of Law, and the Syracuse University College of Law Bonshenik and King Distinguished Professorship. She also taught at law schools at the University of Arizona, University of Baltimore, and Northern Illinois University. In addition to the CCJI related courses, her teaching areas include criminal law, criminal procedure, race and law, voting rights, professional responsibility, and women in criminal justice system. Thereafter, you'll hear from James Gardner, who's a professor at the University of Buffalo School of Law and a nationally recognized expert in election law. Professor Gardner, most recent books include The Election in the Law American Political System, What Are Campaigns For?, The Role of Persuasion in Electoral Law and Politics, and a new revision of his legal argument, The Structure and Language of Effective Advocacy. I ask that if you have any questions that may come up during any portions of our panelist discussions, that you use the Q&A in order to submit those questions. And at the conclusion of the panelist presentations, we'll go forward with the Q&A session. Thank you. And having said that, Paula. Sorry, Paula. You have
okay. All right. We will get this program underway. Thank you so much, Dwayne. And let me thank all of the organizers, everyone associated with the Monroe County Bar Association for inviting me to participate with you. I've had the pleasure of doing another program with the Monroe County Bar Association and the Black Bar. So it's glad to be with you all again. The part of the program in starting for us is to provide something of the historical context, bringing us up to date. And so I have titled my part of this discussion, Past and Prologue, Voter Suppression in the United States. And I want to begin by having us remember that voting rights in the United States historically has been more characterized by exclusion than inclusion. So often now we are talking about universal voting rights, and that continues to be the quest because since the founding of the nation, fewer people were eligible to vote than those in the population who were eligible. Who were ineligible than who were eligible to vote. So at this early stage in the founding of the country, it was primarily white landed classes, moneyed classes who were eligible to vote in elections. And so it has been we have been on a trajectory to try to increase the voting rights across the board on so many levels. And that includes certainly race. It also includes gender, age as well, poverty, as well as disability. And as we have gone on through our nation's history, groups within those different categories and certainly overlapping have struggled and fought and died in order to get the right to vote. I want to begin then by talking about the matter of gender as an initial issue with respect to voter suppression and who was ineligible to vote, because not only on the basis of race, but also on the basis of gender, across all classes, women were ineligible to vote in elections in the United States. And so before the 19th Amendment was passed, women of all races, white women, Black women, other women of color, were not entitled to vote. That slowly began to change. For instance, several of the Western states, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, Utah, allowed women to vote prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment. But what is significant about this is that the struggle for women's suffrage was also very much closely tied to the struggle for racial justice as it related to coming out of the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, and for our purposes tonight, in particular, the 15th Amendment, which conferred voting rights on Black men coming out of the institution of enslavement. And so for a number of women, for instance, who had been involved in the abolitionist movement, they also sought to have the 15th Amendment include gender in it. And as we know, it did not. And it took, several, decades until that occurred. So speaking about the 15th Amendment then, Black men were able to vote after the Civil War ended, and so during the period of Reconstruction. But it's also important to note that discriminatory practices continued even in the aftermath of granting full citizenship rights under the 14th Amendment and abolition of slavery under the 13th. These things continue to happen despite these constitutional provisions, and to a great degree, a lackluster enforcement by the federal government to make sure that these rights were observed. And this was especially true with respect to voting rights. One of the things that happened in the immediate aftermath of the 15th Amendment was there was a great surge in Black political involvement. The voting ranks increased. Black men exercised their right to vote in great numbers. This was also a period in our nation's history when the highest percentage of elected Black officials occupied not only federal positions, but also state and local positions. So it was a period of great political activity and electoral activity on the part of the Black populace and the Black electorate during that time. But what we know too is that there were persistent efforts to deny the right to vote by African Americans, and some of that included violence, including lynchings, in order to prohibit Black men from voting. This period was also characterized by the Black Codes, which were specific laws that were directed at the African American community, such that certain activities were considered crimes if they were committed by Blacks, but not crimes if they were committed by whites. Also characterized by poll taxes, literacy tests, very limited hours for voting. There were whites-only primaries that we saw, as well as Jim Crow laws and the like. And so, in the wake of the passage of the 15th Amendment and greater political participation, what became necessary in the face of all of this resistance, and sometimes violent resistance to Black enfranchisement, was that the Civil Rights Act of 1965 was enacted in order to effectuate the promises of the 15th Amendment that had not been observed. And so 1965 represents a turning point again in terms of the rate of Black participation in the electoral system. We saw, for instance, states, primarily in the South, where the voter registration or voter participation rate was well below 50%. And so with the passage of the 1965 Act, those numbers would increase upwards of numbers of 70, 80% or more in places where Black folks, simply could not vote or were intimidated against voting. And one of the key aspects of the Voting Rights Act, of 1965, was the preclearance provision of that act. And so in those states, and they were primarily Southern states, but they weren't entirely Southern states. In fact, there are some counties in New York which were covered by the Voting Rights Act of 65. Under this formula, where those states that had previously had a pattern of depressing the Black vote, depressing or suppressing the Black vote, and so where the registration rates were well below 50%, those states had to get preclearance under Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act before they could make any changes to their electoral systems. So, for instance, they could not change the polling places, they couldn't change the polling hours. I mean, just a number of things that were done in a way that might have seemed facially neutral, but had a disparate impact on voters of color, and others, I might add, who might have been marginalized in ways in which it was not conducive to the exercise of their votes. And so the Voting Rights Act of '65 was a direct response going all the way back to 1870 with the 15th Amendment and trying to make real the promise and the constitutional command that there be voting rights. In 2013, the Voting Rights Act became more vulnerable with the Shelby County decision. And I should note that every year after 1965, when the Voting Rights Act came up for renewal, it was renewed. But of course, many of those states, particularly the ones that were under the pre-clearance requirements, would chafe at the requirement that they had to be pre-approved by the Department of Justice for any changes that they made in their voting systems in their states. And so the Shelby County decision came about. And the reason I mention this is because with Shelby County came what many would say was the evisceration of the main and most effective parts of the 65 Act. And so once the court declared those sections, the pre-clearance section of the Voting Rights Act to be unconstitutional, states immediately erected barriers or impediments to voting. And so that, again, had a disproportionate impact on communities of color and worked to have more voter suppression as a result of that. And so what we have seen since that, I mean, almost immediately after the Shelby County decision, there were states that began to require voter ID laws, and they began to make other kinds of changes that would depress the votes. And so that became very difficult. There were less accessible polling places, proof of citizenship requirements, gerrymandering on the basis of race, voter roll purges began to take place, and the closure of numerous polling places. You all might have seen, for instance, that the election in Georgia, the governorship in Georgia with Stacey Abrams, where there were just lines, right, where people were just, wrapped around these different polling places, and most recently in the primary in Georgia, as a result of having closed polling places that were closer to communities of color. So what is past is prologue, because we see that these efforts to continue to suppress or depress the Black vote, the votes of other people of color, continues to persist in our society, and that is what we continue to fight against. Let me just close with my remarks by saying that what is before Congress right now is the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill, and that piece of legislation was passed by the House of Representatives, and what we are waiting on is action from the Senate in order to pass that legislation, so that these actions that work a discriminatory impact on Black and brown voters will restore access, eligibility, and the right to vote. So why don't I stop there and look forward to to our further discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Paula. Now, our next distinguished panelist, Jim Garner.
Thanks very much. I have a PowerPoint. Kevin, you there? Unfortunately, due to a different technological problem, I don't have control over it. So Kevin is going to have to put up the slides. if he is available. All right. So let me preface what I'm going to say in the following way. I've been studying election law for a long, long time, and vote suppression has been a part of that, as Paula very thoroughly documented for a long, long time. Nevertheless, 4 years ago, if I were to give this talk, it would have been very different. And the reason is a lot has happened in the past 4 years, and a lot of things have become clear in the last 4 years. And looking backwards from right now, a lot of things look different than they did at the time they happened. And so what I'm going to try and do is put contemporary vote suppression in its contemporary context, which is heavily related to a global trend toward authoritarianism. And this is what I hope to show you in the lecture. So Kevin, can you go to the next? Okay, so why is vote suppression important? So Kevin, I'm just going to say next. So can you do the next? So universally, vote suppression is important because it's a kind of cheating. It's a cheating at the rules of democracy, and cheating in the rules of democracy is a threat to electoral legitimacy. That is, it threatens the claim that election winners can make to actually be the legitimate holders of power. Next. In the present context, though, I think actually much more is at stake than merely cheating, because the question is no longer just who wins under the rules, but what's at stake is truly, and this may seem extreme, but I hope to persuade you otherwise, the entire system of democratic rules, I believe, is at stake. And that is because the United States, far from standing outside of international affairs, as our president seems to want, is actually deeply involved in the midst of a worldwide trend moving towards populist authoritarianism. And what's at stake is liberal democracy itself. That's my claim. All right, so let me, let me, wait a minute, wait, Kevin, not so fast. I'll say next. I want to just give you a little background to get a running start to this subject. Next. All right, so the foundation of the US political system is liberalism. And what I mean by liberalism is not political liberalism. I don't mean partisan liberalism, like Democrats are liberal and Republicans are conservative. I mean philosophical liberalism. All right, so what are the elements of that? Next. One is, and it starts from the fundamental political equality of all citizens. Some of the other tenets of liberalism, very briefly, are next. A basic set of human rights, next. Popular sovereignty, this is the idea that the people rule themselves, next. And the rule of law as opposed to the rule of men. The idea of liberalism was invented as a way of escaping the rule of men, namely the rule of monarchs in the pre-Enlightenment period. Okay, next. Now, what is the relationship between liberalism and democracy? There is some disagreement among political theorists on this question. Next. Historically, democracy and liberalism do travel together. I would say the weight of opinion is that democracy is necessary to make good on liberal commitments, but even if it's not, I'm going to assume that it is for purposes of this discussion. Next. So we are in the midst of a global turn towards authoritarianism. Next. So over the course of the 20th century, as you probably know, there was an explosion in the number of democracies. This was a result of two things primarily. One is decolonization following World War II. The other was the fall of communism. Next. Now, not all these new democracies survived or survived continuously as democracies. A good example is Argentina, which went through periods of authoritarianism alternating with democracy. When democracies crashed, the old way for most of the 20th century was through a military coup, either that or massive electoral fraud undertaken pretty much in the open. But in the current era, we're witnessing a new phenomenon, which is appropriately called democratic backsliding. And so what next? what democratic backsliding involves, typically it involves the replacement of democracy by right-wing populism. Next. And in instances of democratic backsliding, there is no coup, there's no overthrowing of the government, but power is achieved through legal democratic means by actually winning an election. Next. However, once in power, right-wing populists then pursue a program of incremental degradation of liberal and democratic norms so that they can never be displaced from power. Next. Here's a chart that documents what I was just talking about. So this shows the coup frequency in democracies in since the mid of the 20th century. The dotted line is coup attempts and the gray line is successful ones. You can see it peaked in the 1960s and then tailed off. Next. And here's the incidence of vote fraud, open vote fraud, as I described. And again, you can see the trend is down. Next. So where is democratic backsliding occurring? Well, it is occurring in some of the least stable democracies, recent democracies. So in these countries in South America and also in the Philippines. Next. But not just there, also in very large, prosperous or previously prosperous countries like Brazil. Next. And not just in the Southern Hemisphere, but in Turkey, which is a modern state and an EU candidate, and in Hungary and Poland, which are actually members of the EU. Next. And in India, the world's largest democracy. Next. Next. And it is indisputably occurring here in the United States. Next. The Economist Democracy Index has downgraded us to a flawed democracy where we used to be a model of democracy. Next. And according to Freedom House, which is an organization that measures human rights around the world, the number of highly defective democracies has doubled in just this 4-year period. Next. And today, 35% of the world's population now lives in what's been called autocratizing nations. Next. All right, so this pattern has become so common that people who study it, comparativists, are able to assemble what is called really an authoritarian's playbook, which is essentially a common playbook that aspiring authoritarians have followed around the world and certainly in the countries that I've mentioned. So what's in the authoritarian playbook? Let's take a look. Next. First, demonize the opposition. Next. Undermine judicial independence. Next. Attack the independence of the media. Next. Gain control of public broadcasting if there is a public broadcasting system. Next. Impose stricter controls on the internet if that's possible. Next. Subdue civil society, especially NGOs. Next. Intimidate the business community to prevent them from using their wealth to support the political opposition. In Russia, for example, Putin has jailed oligarchs that don't support him and confiscated their property. Next, enrich crony capitalists, so you have a new cadre of supporters. Next, assert political control over the civil service, so in other words, stock it with unquestioning loyalists so it doesn't operate impartially anymore. Next, rig elections. Next. Gain control over the body that runs elections. Okay, next. And then repeat. Okay, so next. I'm going to concentrate on, because of the topic, I'm going to concentrate on the rigging of elections and the gaining control over the body that runs elections, because that's our topic. But the point that I need to make here is that these are not isolated. Attempts to suppress votes and rig elections cannot, I believe, be isolated from these other phenomena. And you can see, it's obvious that the Trump administration checks a lot of these boxes. But I'm not going to talk about those. I'm just going to talk about the two that are most relevant. Next. All right, so let's talk about rigging the electoral rules. In the United States, there have been 2 points of attack. Number 1 is to attack voter eligibility so that people can't become even eligible to vote. And number 2, if that doesn't work, then try to suppress voting by those who have managed to clear the hurdles of eligibility. Next. So let's look at attacks on voter eligibility. Next. So one of the most extreme of these is something that Paula mentioned before, which is demanding documentary proof of citizenship. The strictest laws of this type are in Kansas and Arizona, and they've had an important effect. In Kansas, 20% of new registrations were suspended for lack of adequate proof, and it just turns out, incidentally, that Democrats are 1.5 times more likely than Republicans to have their registration suspended. Next. Another tactic also mentioned by Paula is registration purges. The 3 most active states, you see there, Ohio, Kansas, and Florida. And in Ohio, it was really unbelievably extreme. In a 5-year period, the infamous Ohio Secretary of State, John Husted, purged 2 million names from the rolls, which he claimed inaccurately were names of people who were no longer existed or alive, and just floating around to be used by voters waiting to impersonate them. And it also, again, it happened that more than twice as many names that were purged tended to be in Democratic leaning than in Republican leaning neighborhoods. Next. Another tactic that's been used is to restrict, make it harder for people to register to vote. Next. So an example from Florida. Florida passed a law that imposed absolutely onerous fines on civic groups that engage in voter registration drives, and you incurred this liability if you fail to turn in new registrations within 48 hours or to maintain very copious and burdensome records. So burdensome was this law that 2 major and well-known get out the vote groups, the League of Women Voters and Rock the Vote, well known to be nonpartisan voter registration organizations, suspended their drives and had to sue the state before they would take another step. In Texas passed a law that prohibited registration drives except by officially appointed quote-unquote volunteers. In other words, they had to have the approval of the state to go out and engage in voter registration drives, and for that they had to complete a training course which was not offered nearly with the requisite frequency, and there were criminal penalties for late submission of new registration forms. And obviously this is designed to deter people from engaging in voter registration drives at all. Next. Okay, I would be remiss if I did not mention this event from Florida. So you probably know that by initiative, the voters of Florida repealed a long-standing voting disqualification of felons, which is one of the harshest in the nation. Immediately following that, the legislature subverted it entirely by passing a law which requires full payment of all back fines as a condition for registration by felons. The NBank 11th Circuit just upheld this law in a divided opinion earlier this week. Next. All right, so let's move now to suppression by eligible voters. So one of the, by now, a venerable tactic, which has been undertaken since the 90s, is passing strict voter ID, and you can see the strictest states right there. Many of these measures are accompanied by highly selective rules about what documentation will be accepted. You know, I think the most egregious is in Texas and Tennessee, where they accept gun licenses, but not student ID. Next. Okay, and then there's a bunch of measures, and these are, I should say, these are all in Republican-controlled states, that make voting inconvenient. So shrinking the early voting period, reducing hours of operation, reducing the number of polling places. And now with the pandemic as cover, these states are going back and even making further reductions on using the excuse that they don't need to staff as many polling places and so on because so many people will be voting by mail. Next. On the other hand, the same states that are doing that are resisting measures to enhance convenience. The Republican Party, the Trump campaign are suing all over the nation in Democratic-controlled states to prevent COVID from being used as an excuse for absentee voting. Here in New York, it is allowed. And they're resisting the use of ballot drop boxes at polling places so that people can vote their absentee ballots without having to actually use the mail. Next. All right, so the other tactic here in the authoritarian's playbook is to gain control over the body that runs elections. In many countries, that means there's some central election authority, but in the United States, there isn't any. So the body that runs elections in the United States is state legislatures. So to gain control over the body that runs elections, you have to control state legislatures, and the way to do that is gerrymandering. And the Republicans introduced this nationwide plan called Red Map for the 2010 census, which was extremely successful. And you can see there some figures of vote-to-seat ratios from Pennsylvania and Ohio. The plan was so successful that Republicans were actually able to flip control of Congress entirely. Next. Another tactic that was tried in Republican-controlled states is mid-decade redistricting. This was never done ever before 2003. Nobody thought of it. Nobody thought it was legitimate. But in Texas and Colorado, when Republicans gained control of both chambers, they did enact new, highly gerrymandered plans. In Colorado, the Supreme Court did invalidate that. Next. Next. And I would be remiss to mention one of the most egregious things in 2018 in North Carolina, immediately following the election of a Democratic governor, but before he was able to take office, the Republican-controlled state legislature stripped the governor's office of a power that it had retained for a long time to appoint members of the state election board. That too was blocked by the state Supreme Court under the state constitution. And then finally, next. So this is the last point. The federal government basically has nothing to do with elections. Elections are run under state law with very minor exceptions, and one major exception, which is, or what used to be a major exception, the Voting Rights Act that you just heard about. That has changed this cycle because of the pandemic. With the pandemic, suddenly the Postal Service has a big role in elections, although not an official role. And this is a lever by which the federal government, in very unusual circumstances, may actually be able to affect how the election goes. Of course, we've all been hearing about the Trump appointee who seems to be working to impair the ability of the post office to handle absentee ballots. Okay. That's it, and I look forward to your questions.
Now we have several questions here, and just starting off with something that Paula mentioned, and that is the gutting of the 1965 Civil Rights Act and the proposal that is now over 200 days old, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Has Mitch McConnell given any indication that he intends to at least bring it to the floor to a vote?
You know, I've been trying to keep abreast of what's going on with respect to this legislation, and I've gotten no indication that there's a plan to bring it for a vote on the Senate floor. You know, there were a lot of comments after Congressman Lewis passed away. You know, many platitudes, you know, and, you know, deserved accolades, you know, for him and his, you know, lifetime of struggle, you know, for racial justice and human rights, really, for all people. And some of those, you know, words came, you know, from the Republican side as well, including in the Senate. But not one member of the Senate spoke on the Senate floor to say that this legislation ought to come up for a vote. So I've heard nothing to date about a plan in that regard.
This is a question for both. Given the depth of the presentations that we just heard, specifically dealing with the lack of federal oversight that are involved in the election, do you support any type of centralized federal control over the voter registration and or voting process?
I can jump in on this first. This is a very, very interesting issue. So for a long, long time, many people have criticized the United States for not having a centralized election agency. And we get compared unfavorably to other nations that do have it. Just across the border in Canada, Elections Canada is a highly professional agency that runs really everything. And in Australia, they have one. Most countries, in Mexico, they have one. I think so if you're inclined to think that, though, I think recent events have to give us pause. If the federal government had centralized control over elections, number one, that would mean that President Trump would have his hands on those levers. And would that be a good thing? I would think not. He doesn't seem to be able to show much self-restraint when it comes to using the electoral system to his own advantage. That's number one. Number two, there's significant foreign hacking attempts of our electoral system by the Russians, by the Chinese, supposedly by the Iranians, who knows? And if there's one centralized system, if somebody gets that, they've hacked the entire thing. One of the advantages of decentralization associated with federalism is that if you want to hack the American election, you got to hack 50 different jurisdictions. So I don't know. There's considerations pointing in different directions.
Oh, I'm not certain if you
Yeah,
want to.
I would say yes. I mean, let me just add a couple of thoughts. I mean, I'm really of two minds about it also, much for the reasons that Jim has just mentioned. Although I'm not sure how it comes out in the balance, because there's so much mischief that is happening from state to state, then I'm not sure that it wouldn't be helpful to have something more centralized, because people's right to vote should not be based on the idiosyncrasies of what state they happen to reside in. And so to the extent that we don't have, requirements that, transcend, state borders, it really does trouble me that your rights could be contingent on, something, very, very, minuscule, just by crossing into another state. And so, I wonder if something more centralized would not help, at least as an overarching kind of administrative way to handle things. There are different types of governmental agencies. There are independent governmental agencies, so that at least theoretically, the party, in power in the White House doesn't have control over what happens in those agencies, versus the ones where, you have presidential appointments and so forth. So I actually think it might be something, worth considering, and whether or not any of those safeguards that are required along the lines, of hacking, for instance, are things that we need to explore.
In that same vein, just to kind of tweak one of the questions that was asked in regards to the Electoral College, what are your thoughts on alleviating or removing the Electoral College, and what kind of effects would it have as far as just a majority rule, one vote, one voter election, and not only for the presidency, but also for the House of Representatives, where something to the effect of the top 4 or 3, however many representatives that state might have, be entitled to come from a straight popular vote instead of a districting, where you are subject to gerrymandering.
Yeah, go ahead.
Start with that one. Okay, sure. So I can't help, but think, when I think about the Electoral College, to recall that it also, has, origins in, in the slave state. And so, these things are, in my view, they are relics of this era, where under the guise of making things more proportionate and more equal, that in fact it can disenfranchise, numerous voters, because the popular vote is discounted, in favor of the number of electoral votes that a particular state has. My own preference would be, to simply go with a with a straight popular vote system. I think that we have advanced far enough, that the Electoral College no longer serves the purpose, of really expressing what the popular will is. And I think we have seen that in several of our most recent elections. The highly contentious, and concerning situation with Bush versus Gore. And if that didn't give us a sense that we need to do away with the Electoral College, then I'm not sure what did. And certainly in this last election, the Trump-Clinton election, where she won the election by the popular vote, it seems to me that really, to do otherwise, really betrays the popular will. And so I would favor, for us to adopt a popular vote system. I think we are an advanced enough nation, were we to get this situation, cleared up with the post office and all the other concerns that, we're worried about now. I think that there's no reason why we shouldn't just simply count the ballots, of people who vote, and determine who the winner of an election is.
Yeah, okay, so this is a perennial issue, or quadrennial issue, I guess. So let me say the best that can be said about the Electoral College. The best that can be said about it is, number one, it was a compromise. It was necessary to create the nation. Without it, we probably wouldn't have a nation, which is maybe not saying very much. Number two, it does come from an era when notions of equality were, I'll say, broader, maybe less well defined, than they are now. Today, when we think of equality in terms of governance of a country, we think of equality of people, and that's it. That goes all the way back to the Supreme Court's decision in Reynolds versus Sims in 1964. The Electoral College is built around another kind of equality, which is equality of regions. And I guess in the early history of the country, that was an important way to think about things, or let's say that it was. But certainly today, Paul's absolutely right. We've come a long distance from that. People don't think in those terms. They think of equality of people. And so, yeah, the Electoral College is obsolete, and it produces these anomalous results. And here's another way to think about it. Many aspects of the US Constitution have been copied by other countries around the world, not this one. So yeah, I'd love to see us get rid of it. What's the problem with that? It'll never happen. It will require a constitutional amendment, and that will require at least some of the smaller states to join the larger states in amending the Constitution. It never will, because they have a slight electoral advantage in the existing system. Dwayne, you also mentioned something interesting, which was at-large voting for congressional districts. In the early days of the Republic, states went about it in different ways. Sometimes they would hold a statewide at-large election, in which case generally the majority party would sweep all the seats. Or some states held districted elections, and often they would change their laws opportunistically to give an advantage to the party that temporarily held control of the state legislature. Sort of a kind of gerrymandering. It's gerrymandering the electoral rules. I think, there's general agreement now that holding elections from districts is far better than holding at-large statewide elections, because if you hold them statewide, you submerge the minority completely, whether it's partisan minority or a racial minority or religious minority, whatever the minority is. But on the other hand, you can have at-large voting on a less than statewide scale that will give you a much closer approach to proportionality than either of those two systems at the extremes. An example of that is a system that Illinois had until it amended its constitution in the 60s, was that each state legislative election district elected 3 members. And 2 of the members were from the party that got the most votes, and the 3rd member was from the minority party. So it produced a rough kind of proportionality, which, you know, I think most people think that's the fairest way to do it.
Just
Can I
for
just
those
say
that are,
one last thing about that? Oh, I'm sorry, Dwayne. I just want to say one other thing, because as Jim was speaking, I was, also thinking that there are different ways of arriving at what one might consider to be a fair result. So, for instance, there are, local elections, certainly, where, say, the 3 top vote getters will take positions. Whether or not that might be something that can be replicated on the state level or the congressional level. But there are, ways of doing this so that it isn't always a winner take all system. And so there are states and municipalities, for instance, that are experimenting with different types of percentages where they determine who occupies, elected positions. So I think that is something, worthy of, exploring as well.
we want to get right back to the discussion, but I just have to take care of this, and that's for those looking for the code for the CLE credit. It's 1758. 1758. All right, now jumping right back into it, what would be some of the hurdles in regards to making any type of centralized agency or rule changes on a federal level that would affect the states, that would run afoul of states' rights?
I take this.
Well, I think you put your head. I think that's it. I think that states are going to, resist, the reduction of any of their authority. As Jim says, it's really the states that run elections, and including the mechanisms or the processes for federal elections. Those things are determined by the states. And so much of that decision-making process rests with those who are in control, or, the political party, in control of the states who make those decisions. So it would have to be something where on a, bipartisan degree, people said, this is in the best interest of all of us, irrespective of our political party, because we think it is a better system. We think it's a more secure system. It's not so, subject to all of the, play or mischief that might happen in the way that elections are run, including the eligibility rules for being able to vote. But people don't like to concede that kind of power, and so I would imagine there's resistance. And as we've said, it would require a constitutional amendment to do so, and that requires 3/4 of the states to pass a constitutional amendment, and we've seen that is not a very easy process either.
Yeah. So let me come at it this way. So what's the constitutional authority? Suppose we did want to set up a centralized federal election regulatory agency. Is that even constitutional? And the answer is complicated. It is completely constitutional under Article 1, Section 4 for the federal government to regulate federal elections. So Article 1, Section 4 says the states regulate federal elections in the first instance, but Congress can at any time displace state rules if Congress doesn't like them. So Congress could set up a federal agency, I think, like the Federal Election Commission, but with much broader powers, that would regulate federal elections, but it would not have the authority to regulate state elections. If Congress wants to establish centralized control over state elections, there are two ways that this would happen. One would be that Congress would have to use its enforcement powers under the 14th and 15th Amendments, as it did when it enacted the Voting Rights Act, and mainly the Voting Rights Act and the various amendments. So it would have to be of limited authority to enforce requirements of equal protection and, of course, requirements of equal protection and the 15th Amendment prescription on discrimination and voting on the basis of race. However, there is an informal source of federal authority to regulate state elections, and it occurs in the following way. Even though federal law can only regulate federal elections, the way that Congress has since Reconstruction couched its laws is in terms of behavior that takes place at an election at which federal offices are on the ballot. Now, because virtually all states, for virtually all state offices, run their elections at the same time, on the same day, in the same place as federal elections, then regulations that are that apply to federal elections have a much bigger footprint because they apply to elections at which state officials are also on the ballot. Now, states don't have to do that, and there has been some talk, I think in Arizona they were talking maybe about splitting it up and having state elections at one time and federal elections at another time so that they could do what they wanted with state elections, such as onerous citizenship documentation requirements.
So would, in your opinion, would the best way to go about trying to get this kind of centralized or federal standard would be through a new Voting Rights Act?
Well, a new Voting Rights Act would take care of some kinds of problems, but it wouldn't take care of other kinds of problems. It would certainly, if Section 4 were reinstated by some amendment that Congress could pass that would survive Supreme Court scrutiny, then you'd, and so we have a pre-clearance regime again, that'd be great, and that would really cut out the most egregious kinds of problems, but it certainly wouldn't cut out unless you could for example, unless you could very laboriously document that the pandemic has a disproportionate impact on protected communities, which apparently it does. I guess there's pretty good evidence of it. Let's say it would be very laborious to produce it. Unless you could do that, there would be no federal control over excuses for absentee balloting. So, I think a more comprehensive federal authority would need to go beyond the scope of just restoring the Voting Rights Act.
I think the timing is would be a factor as well, because voting rights litigation, which I think would inevitably be a part of this, itself is quite painstaking, to get the data, to present this kind of evidence. I mean, one of the things that Chief Justice Roberts said in the Shelby decision in striking it down was that the pre-clearance formula was outdated, in talking about, the interest of state sovereignty, that those states that were previously under that pre-clearance requirement, had come a long way themselves, and so they should no longer be under that, command. But amassing the kind of evidence, particularly if, as the court said in Shelby County, was that Congress needed to come up with another formula, not just new numbers, but another formula. And it's not exactly clear what the court would accept as a formula to show that indeed this racial discrimination or the disparities are persistent. And so that would take, it would seem to me, some time in order for that to make its way, through the courts as a way to get this done in a centralized way. And I'm not sure that the statute, that the legislation would address every part of that. That really concerns us, to make sure that everyone that we think is eligible to vote would be able to vote.
And as it pertains to this election right here, and trying to make sure everyone that is eligible to vote and those that either haven't been purged or haven't or have secured the necessary documentation for voting, is granted the ability to vote either through absentee voting. What do you see happening in this election regarding the absentee voting? And the potential for there not to be a decision for quite some time after Election Day?
Well, I'll tell you, my own sense of it is, I don't know, Jim, I'm interested to hear what you say too. I think we're in a really, precarious situation right now, not because the election can't be handled, albeit with greater numbers of absentee ballots being cast, but because because the president is continuing to plant this idea that it would be problematic to have so many absentee ballots. So he is sowing the seeds of distrust in the election. And that is a sentiment that even on an unconscious level can seep into people's consciousness, where the legitimacy of the election can come into question. And so I think that that is something that has to be squelched at every turn and on every level, that we have to have confidence in our institutions, including the Postal Service, which so many people are going to rely on in this coming election. So we have to make sure that those systems are secure. It's interesting to me, for instance, that that we're sowing discord and even disinformation as it relates to the Postal Service, but won't question the same kinds of things that have been verified with respect to the hacking of foreign countries into our elections, that we have to absolutely pay attention to and make sure that these things don't affect our elections. So I am frankly less concerned. I'm a poll watcher, and I watch every election. I'll stay up until the wee hours of the morning until somebody is declared a winner, if that's the case, or wake up first thing in the morning to find out. But I am much less concerned that sometime after midnight that we're able to declare or project a winner, than be able to do that some days after that the election day occurs, in order for us to have an accurate count. My primary beef, for instance, with what happened in Bush versus Gore, was that the Supreme Court acted in a way I thought that was precipitous, and it stopped the count at a time when that process was making its way forward. The nation, the government, was not going to collapse if Florida had continued to count those ballots. And it seems to me that we might have that happen on a broader scale, and that we, in the interest of accuracy, can withstand having the outcome unknown, if it comes to that. if those ballots are coming in and the balance is such that it is clear, that it just becomes academic at a certain point and there's no way for the other candidate to win, then that's one thing. But if it's a very close, too close to call election, then I'm not perturbed at all by taking the time that it takes in order for us to count those ballots and make sure that we know the accuracy of the outcome of the election.
Yeah. So the question is, what's likely to happen. So let me throw out a couple of things in decreasing order of certainty. I think the most certain thing that will happen is that the counting will be delayed, and the delay could be significant. We've seen states struggle during the primary season to handle all the ballots that were cast, and the general election turnout is generally much higher than in the primary. So that's highly certain. Next, in terms of certainty, is something that political scientists are calling the blue shift. It turns out that it has been true in the past, which is not necessarily to say that it'll be true this time around, but it has been true in the past that Democrats vote by mail more than Republicans. And what that means is the tally of in-person voting on election night will show one thing, but then as the absentee ballots continue to be counted, Democratic votes will roll in, and it can change and has changed the outcome. And that is something that the public views with suspicion because it's used to having definitive results virtually immediately. Speaking now with less certainty, more speculation, one possible outcome of the turn to mail voting is much lower turnout than we're used to. A lot of people don't have experience with voting by mail, and they can screw it up or not do it at all, and that could have effects. If the fewer people vote, the greater the threat to the legitimacy of the outcome. And then finally, sort of there's this, most speculatively of all, there's this sort of worst case scenario of chaos, election agencies unable to process ballots in any way that's reliable. There's the prospect of direct violent interference of a type that we haven't seen since the 19th century. That seems highly speculative to me, and I assume it's not that likely. But if I need something else to lie awake at night about, that would be something.
Now, going to that point, you mentioned in your presentation, and it struck me, and that's the liberal democracy at stake in this election. Yeah. And this is more, I guess, a sociology question, and that's we have these sets of rules and laws, and the only thing that gives them power is that the majority agrees upon a certain set of standards. And what happens with the erosion of that, those standards, i.e. When a politician does something and is not held accountable, and people say, well, how can that be? And you try to explain to them, the laws are only there so long as somebody or the majority agrees to enforce them. So what would happen in your scenario that you ran down in democracy being at stake when you have the complete erosion of an agreed to set of principles, namely the validity of the election as well as the stacking of the courts?
Right. That is in many ways the most important question that sort of hovers in the background here. So one thing that the last 4 years have taught us a brutally hard lesson in is the importance of what's sometimes called informal norms in sustaining a constitutional order. Constitutions are great, and we've had the luxury for 100 years, of being able to look at the Constitution for answers to our questions about how our society is structured without realizing that a lot of this depended on a very strong nationwide consensus. And if that consensus starts to break down, then the constitutional rules that are built on these sort of invisible and informal norms begin to decay too. So, you know, President Trump is a prolific norm breaker. From even before he took office, he was violating the norm against criminally prosecuting your political opponents. He was violating norms of civility. He does this every day. All right, so you know, what that does is it eats away. It's a kind of rot at the foundation of our constitutional system, and that is the most dangerous thing. And you know, we've now had 4 years of broadcasting out of the White House itself of a constant barrage of attacks against our longstanding institutions and customs and norms. And once that's gone, I don't know how easy it is to restore it. So I think that's highly dangerous. I mean, you know, the first item on the authoritarians playbook that I projected before is demonize the opposition. When you demonize the opposition, you give yourself permission to treat them as subhuman. And subhumans are not entitled to the respect and consideration that you would apply to other human beings. And so that means they don't count in the political calculus. And you don't have to take them into consideration. And if enough people believe that and they actually hold power, that is a recipe for, well, authoritarianism, which is we've escaped for more than 200 years.
What can, we have people that volunteer either as poll watchers or get out the vote or letter writing campaigns, you name it. There are people that are actively doing something about it. Is there anything that you would recommend someone taking it upon themselves in order to affect these voter suppression tactics that are being implemented?
You know, I think I think information is key, because part of what's also being propagated is a lot of confusion and misinformation about what people's rights are with respect to voting, with respect to their own eligibility. I followed North Carolina, very closely, for instance, and there were a lot of, situations there where people were being told that their polling places were going to be moved. That didn't turn out to be the case. All kinds of things like this were happening in Georgia as well. And so I think that getting ahead of the misinformation campaign is very important. And that is something that volunteers can do. I think it's very important for, the media, including social media, so that people have accurate information about their own eligibility so that they register in a timely way. Including if they're doing absentee ballots. I don't recall, I had that, I was looking for my note about the deadline for absentee ballots in New York. I think it's October 9th, but I don't want to be quoted on that. But we should have that information at hand so that people don't miss deadlines. And that ought to be out there for everybody in every community to know that that is the case. And so wherever our circles take us, there should be voter information in those places. I also think that is absolutely critical. I think Jim mentioned this before about turnout, or maybe Dwayne, you said something about this too. Beyond voter registration based on eligibility, we have to vote, right? I mean, people have to, they have to cast those votes. And, if people are going to do that in person, I think, You know, I certainly come from a community where the get out the vote effort was massive, and no one had a problem getting to the polls. So, you know, if people can help, even, and maybe especially in this age of COVID-19, where people take the appropriate precautions so that folks can get to the polls and vote if they plan to do that in person. If they do not, then they need to make sure that they are well aware of what the requirements are for voting in advance. But I think that there is a role for everyone in every community, if they care about their society and the underpinnings of democracy that we say undergird us in this society, that we will find a way to contribute to making sure that people who intend to vote, who want to vote, will be able to vote. And that is really what I think is so important. You know, the media, everybody has a role to give people accurate information and to help people get to the polls.
Along with that, one of the things that you mentioned was making sure you get people to turn out and vote, and you also mentioned education. How, in your opinion, watching the lack of participation, one, but also the lack of knowledgeable and correct information being given out, and the turning away from civics being taught at an early age in schools, has had an impact on the, I want to use the word, but I'll use the crumbling of our democracy being actually where it is now, downgraded.
Yeah, I think that is tragic. I actually think that is tragic because, you know, I am involved in, I mean, doing this program, you know, is part of my, you know, involvement in community education. And that is not just for folks in the legal profession. I mean, this is community wide. And, you know, what is so disappointing is that we have in large measure taken this out of, you know, our educational systems. You know, I don't know about, you know, many of the folks out there, you know, we can't see everyone. You know, but I am certainly of an age that from certainly junior high school, we did something called social studies. And then on through high school, we had civics and history, and learned all about the structures of our government. And I scarcely believe that that is the case anymore, where people know what the apparatus of government is. I mean, Jim is talking about authoritarian regimes and how we can lapse into those things, and people don't know where to go to fill out certain forms. These things to me really are tragic. And I think it's incumbent upon us, you don't have to get this in school. I think it's incumbent upon us in all of the spaces that we occupy to make sure that there are forums where you can have people do just what we're doing tonight and talk about the importance of voter education, talk about the importance of voter registration, talk about the history that we began with so that we can know that this is not something that's aberrational. In fact, it is something that has been continuous. The thread is continuous throughout our history. We need to know those things on a practical level. Where do you go to register? How many representatives do you have? You know, New York has been losing representatives because the population has been diminishing. Do people know that? Do they know the significance of having fewer representatives in Congress and what that is based on? And so why the census, for instance, is so important to us on all of these levels. These things have to happen. Churches can have forums. rec centers can have forums. Any place can have a forum. So, and you go to where people are so that they can get the information. They don't always have to come to you. Go to where they live and say, learn about your democratic system and the offices that are so important to your daily life. Those are the kinds of things that I think we can do to enhance our knowledge and awareness, as well as voter turnout.
I could just say very quickly, just add one thing. Maybe we're out of time. Dwayne, you let me know.
Feel free.
You know, the one thing that I sometimes hear from young people that disturbs me the most is when they say, you know, I'm not going to vote. Voting is useless. Voting is a waste of time. And what they don't understand is that politics is the only way to accomplish anything. You have to engage in the political process if you want to move your agenda forward. And there is a tendency among some young people to say, you know, no, what's much more useful is for me to participate with a flash mob and appear someplace and make a lot of loud noise and then disappear, or to tweet out what I have to say on social media. No, this stuff is ephemeral. You have to organize. And the most successful social movements in the world and in our history have been highly organized. The civil rights movement was hierarchical. Oh my gosh, you know, there were clashes about authority. Thurgood Marshall was constantly complaining about SNCC, and you know, these groups were contesting for authority, but it was discipline that got that movement the success as it did. And so you have to engage in politics. That's how things get done. And that message, I wish we were communicating better to young people.
Yeah. And Jim, to your point on that, remember, it was young people who demanded that other folks in this country get the right to vote. I mean, we've been talking about voters, you know, suppression. And so, you know, people need to know this history, you know, that those buses that were going down to the Mississippi Delta to register voters, you know, were people, you know, in their teens and early 20s. And so that was part of a mass movement, a very organized movement that said, we're going to be a part of this process. Our votes are going to count. And you know, and I'm not speaking in a, you know, in a hyperbolic way to say people lost their lives for this right. And it has been the truth throughout our history, either advertently or inadvertently. People who wanted to vote, who were deemed by other people, the kinds of folks who should not be able to vote, persisted anyway. Their homes were firebombed. Their vehicles, the Greyhound bus, the Trailway buses, were firebombed with people trying to register folks, Black folks, many of them, to vote. And so these are the things that we can impress upon young people. I would hope that that is something that they take, you know, to heart. You know, and I can understand dismay. I can understand that people will feel as though, the political system sometimes isn't responsive, to our needs and to our issues. But I don't think that that is a reason to disengage. If anything, I think it's a reason to hold people even more accountable in these systems. But it would be my hope that people remember the legacies that we bring forth, so that every one of us can even be in this struggle to be talking about it and talking about the right to vote.
I want to thank both of you guys. This has been a vigorous and insightful conversation. And if it was up to me, it would continue even past this. For those that are still on, make sure that you go to elections.ny.gov or vote.org, where you can check whether or not you're still registered. And if not, make sure you are registered. And what the panelists, and please step in if I'm wrong, is saying is get educated, make sure that you're registered, but it doesn't stop there. You have to be engaged, and as lawyers, as the gatekeepers of this democracy, it's important that we share the information for those that aren't as educated on the process or the ramifications of elections. So I want to thank both of you. This has been a tremendous pleasure for me. So thank you.
Thanks very
Dwayne,
much.
I just want to say one thing before we sign off. Can I, if
Yes,
we're still
please.
here?
Sure.
And that's just on the point that you made. And that is, Black women, were just excluded from voting. There was the 15th Amendment, and then there was a push for the 19th Amendment. But Black women persisted. They were going to be counted. And, one of the organizations, National Council of Negro Women, the motto was lifting as we climb. And so on your point about going to vote, I want to add this. Don't just go vote yourself. Take somebody with you. Bring people along. If you're going to go to the polls, if you're going to go get the application for absentee ballots, you bring some of those back with you and hand them out to people at your supermarket, at your church, or wherever you go. Don't just do it for yourself. Make sure that somebody else is able to vote as well. Lift as we climb.
Any last words, Jim, and then we'll sign off.
I think that says it all.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much.